What's going on, everybody? Yeah, I just want to get on here and do a quick little audio tutorial on mastering electronic music. Let's see. Let me pull up the screen capture, get the program running here. Yeah, the biggest thing with mastering is to make sure that your mix sounds good. It's like a good mix compared to like a terrible mix. It's going to come out in the mastering. You're going to pop these sounds up and it's pretty much just going to bring out all the things that sound weird in the mix. So I just got this this track I made. I got all the mastering settings. I'm going to turn them all off. So you guys can kind of hear what it sounds like before, like a master, and then after. Alright, and so like when that thing's going, you can basically, some of the best thing to do is to have some headspace. When you get your mix all hitting, and you can do that in multiple different ways, but for the most part, figure about -5 dB for good headspace in a mix. Yeah, that's hitting about in there, and you can check some different meters and whatnot, and you can get in that same zone. That's easy enough. If you're not hitting there, you're hitting too hot. You can just bring those volumes down. You can do that like a parametric EQ. You can raise that up and down. That will for the most part be able to get you that headspace without it clipping. As long as your mix isn't too hot. Because personally, I can't stand that over compressed sound, and with electronic music in particular, I mean that's pretty prevalent. With the loudness war and all that kind of stuff, it's just it just looks like a hot sausage. These waveforms. When people are done with it, and this is a great free tool, and I'm not sure if if this is still available, but it's the TT dynamic range meter. You can actually check your dynamic range, and up here at this correlation meter, you can see if you got some phase issues and whatnot. You can pop it into mono too to check out see if you have any phase issues going on. But this is a free meter, or it used to be free, and I can pop that in the description to link to it if it's still available. But I like using it. I like especially mastering with it in mono for some reason. Just because I like the way everything sounds in stereo when it's done. Because the thing with mastering, you start getting it on like a loop. You just hear it over and over again. And it's hard to make judgments on how things are sounding because you've heard it too many times. But the first step is, like I said, you get yourself a good mix, and once you have that mix and everything's sounding good instrument wise, then it's time to start to master. And with FL Studio, this is basically the signal flow I like to use. So step one, I like to do a 40 hertz cut. Some people can do 30 hertz, but what this does is it starts getting that low frequency sound and music ears can't hear this. You know, before you get, you know, to about 30-40 hertz, the human ear, you can't really hear it. It starts to become like a sub bass frequency in here, and you feel it more than you hear it. You know, but like the thing with it is, if you're not cutting out this audio, the subwoofers are going to still try to play that. And so when they do, it's just going to rumble the subs, and you're going to start getting you know, kind of a muddy sound. You know, so you're going to want to take that off. Same with the super high end. You know, it gets to a point where the human ear can't hear it. You know, it's like a dog whistle. You know, you get it too loud, and or not loud, but you get, you know, that frequency still there. It's going to try to make that sound in the playback device. So you want to take that sound out. And then, you know, typically I like to add another EQ. You don't want to get too carried away with this. You know, if you got frequencies that are popping off that are you know, making weird audio conflicts, you can bring them down just a hair. You know, and kind of there's really no rule of thumb with music, but like about 280 to about 310 hertz, you know, it starts to get a little muddy in that area. You know, because you got a kick and a bass going, and some low end, maybe synths or something like that. They start to clash around this frequency. You know, and you can fix that in a mix on some level, but you can also just barely tweak some of these frequencies in a master. You know, let me you know, play this. Yeah, you can start hearing what that is actually hitting music wise. You know, it's real bassy. Yeah, and if it's too much to do it in an EQ, then you start working on the mix. If it's something that's not subtle, you know, go ahead and just fix that in a mix. You know, if you can. You know, sometimes when you go to master, all you have is like a mixed wave, like a 24-bit wave that you're working with. But if you can get the stems or you get the project file, you know, you can probably go ahead and just start working on fixing that in the mix. You know, one of those little tips, you know, for especially, you know, bass, is to start tweaking some of these stereo fields, and to bring in that stereo sound more centered. You know, that's a good strategy, you know, at times for like the low end, is to tighten up that sound, because you don't really want a super wide bass unless that's the sound you're going for. You know, for like kicks and like a bass and some lower synths and, you know, some lower sounding frequency type instruments. You know, tightening that sound up in the stereo field down here in the mixer, it is a good way to kind of get that muddiness, to try to get a little bit more of a more crisp sound in the low end. You know, and then from there do subtle tweaks in this, you know, second EQ. You know, some people bring up around, you know, it all depends on the music, but like you can make it a little bit higher end, just tap it on there. You know, I mean, if you're getting crazy with it, like I mean, you're doing big time EQ work, you know, something like that, you might want to consider working on a mix before you're messing with a mastered EQ thing like this. But you know, but once you get that sound, you know, sounding all right through just a little EQ work, then you're gonna need a multi-band compressor to really start getting into the mastering. You know, I use Maximus. You know, other people use like Ozone, you know, stuff like that. Really do about the same thing. You can even, I think FL Studio comes with Oh, well, they have it's a different multi-band compressor. I think it's this one, something like that. You could use that if you have like the like a version of FL Studio that doesn't include Maximus. The problem is this just gives you more detail on what you're doing. You know, it's easier to mess with these compression settings, and not to say you can't do it down here, but this is just a little bit more advanced, and a little bit easier to dial in that sound that you're going for. I'm actually going to do a sound check. I probably should have done that to begin with. Yeah, because I'm doing this thing live, just because to dial in that sound. You know, just to you make this easier. Yeah, I'm using OBS to do these live streams, and like I figure, yeah, I'd rather just do it this way than just like producing a video and stuff like that. So I just do a live stream. But like any multi-band compressor, if you don't have you know, Maximus or Ozone or some of these, you know, higher end you know, mastering compressors, a multi-band compressor is basically good enough on some level. You know, and so basically what these multi-band compressors mean is just like with Maximus here. You have the low, the mid, and the high. This free, I think for most versions of FL Studio, has the same situation: low band, mid band, and high band. You know, the difference is in how it functions, and the simplicity, and really what you can do with it. You know, and so let me get this going and give some examples here. I'm gonna bring that down so I can talk over it. Yeah, so here at the low band, you can hear really some of that synth, some of that bass, and kind of the first thing I like to do with it is I like to cut this out to these lower frequencies. You can do about 30 hertz, you know, to 40, and just kind of just play it by ear. You know, where you like that low end to hit. You know, the thing to keep in mind is when you're compressing audio, what it does is it shrinks these peaks and it boosts this low. So, you know, the difference between these peaks and the lows, you know, is your dynamic range. You know, and so if you have some like sub bass that's hitting down here, and you're bringing that sound up, these 30 hertz, these 35 hertz, that's going to get louder and louder. You know, and typically you don't hear those as much as you feel them, and so you almost want to be careful with how much of this low end you're going to keep on there, just because it could start to muddy up your sound as you're working on your mix. You know, and so kind of the same situation. You can you know, start from scratch in Maximus. You know, just as a default setting. You know, then they have these like presets, but the thing with presets is like you know, it's not much different than you know, they have that that just automatic like mastering website where you just like submit your track and then it'll just come back. You know, and the thing with that is, I mean, you're trying to really shape a sound when you're mastering and really give it a good feeling. And these are just kind of generic. You know, if you want to blast your compression, you know, I mean, it's all about the sound that you want. There's no real right answers here. You know, it's music. It's like an art. You know, but like if you're gonna like go with a preset, if you're still kind of learning what all these things do and all these different sounds, you know, how they relate to the track you're working on, you know, take it, you know, beyond just the preset. I mean, you can load the preset up. If it sounds okay, well then start to learn what these buttons do, you know, because then you can start to shape a sound from there, you know. And so if you're looking at this low end, and what we're doing here is we're compressing. Here's 0 decibels, and you can start to change that compression setting and how fast or slow that's going to start to respond as the volume increases towards 0 decibels in loudness. So you can crank it down like that. You can see how that relates to what it's doing to the peaks of your sound. It's a faster compression. And so it's basically one of those situations, if you like that kind of sound, you can start to adjust your threshold here. And at the same time, you know, say your volume's up here. Well, you're barely getting any compression. You know, this peak of this kick is basically what you're seeing right there. And so the compression isn't going to kick in until it gets to a certain loudness. And you can set that along this little line here. And so you can bring it down if you want a lot of compression, and start to experiment with that on some level. You know, I like dynamic music, you know, so I don't like heavy compression. You know, I try to really stay out of the loudness war game and try to focus more on just whatever it sounds like, you know, and just keeping it dynamic. Because that's a nice thing about like producing in this way, is you have so much freedom, you know, dynamic wise. I mean, you have no loud without quiet. And if you're producing for something that's going to just you know, end up on Spotify or anything like that, they have noise normalization, compression type algorithms and stuff like that in place. And radio, if you're producing for something that's going to end up on the radio, it's the same situation. You know, they're going to compress it. You know, so if you're going to have an ultra loud track with like a very little dynamic range, it's going to sound worse because you can't get that back, you know, once it's gone. And so kind of the same situation. You kind of start to adjust where your peaks are hitting, and then the amount of tension that you want to put on the compression, and you just play that by ear at first, and kind of go through each one of these little knobs on some level. You know, and so one of the things I like to mess with is the release, and that's the release of the compression. You know, and so if you have a longer release time, it's going to have more of a thuddy type sound, especially on kicks, on low end. It's going to bring that sound. Basically, it's compressing at this peak, but then it's drawing out that sound so that more behind it is compressed too. So then the faster the release time, the less of this sound after that peak is affected by the compression. You know, and you can mess with the attack in somewhat the same way, which is how fast the compressor starts to work when a peak is felt. And so the peak is, you know, set right in here is where it starts. This is where it stops. So the compression takes place in this area. And so it's like, how fast does this thing need to pop off once this threshold, once this like once this level gets crossed. And each one of those has a different impact on the sound. And as you're working on that, just kind of dialing in how fast you want it, what kind of sound you want to make. Some of that comes with experience, just messing with this stuff for a while. But generally, kind of a more of a thuddy type sound, more drawn out, is a longer release time. You want like a pluckier sound, more punchy. Shorten that release time. And then kind of the same thing with this on some level. What this does is it separates where these frequencies start to get affected. And so if you want a general rule of thumb when kind of separating out these bass frequencies, is listen to the mid, and you want just the top, of maybe the bass. I mean, you don't want to hear a throbbing bass in your mids, because you're really targeting a different section of the music. Think of the lows as like the kick and the bass, and then the same thing when you're separating out the highs. You want to barely hear the hi-hats. And so that gives you kind of an idea what the hi-hats sound like. Let me turn that up so you guys can hear it. But you really want your highs to be hi-hats, top of the snare. And that's kind of a, I wouldn't say a template, but it gives you an idea, at least a starting spot, to kind of separate these different bands in Maximus. And once those bands are set, then typically what I like to do is I like to mess with the this goes to the stereo of it all. Just the low end. When you're on this channel, these settings only affect this channel. And so when you have like a bass, typically bass is centered in a mix. And what this does is say, I like to kind of tighten up the stereo in the individual channels, but at the same time, at the overall lows, I like to tighten that up. And this kind of goes by ear too. If everything you're playing is like mono, and then you go full mono, full pan center, it almost causes some phase issues. It sounds like it doesn't sound necessarily as good. But if you don't mess with the stereo fields in your channels, well, then you can use this to tighten up that bass and that low frequency sound. And once you do that, you just go by ear again, and you find that spot where it sits nice, in your headphones and your monitors and all that. And there's no right or wrong answer to what sounds right. I mean, that's part of your ears and what you're doing with music. And then this is an interesting. This adds a little saturation, which on some level you can overdo it. With mastering, and it's real easy to start to get carried away with it. I don't know how to describe it other than that. I mean, a little goes a long way when you're mastering. And so here's what it sounds without the saturation. It starts adding a little warmness and a little bit of a little energy too when you start messing with the saturation. Almost gives it somewhat of like an analog sound to it to a degree. But then when you do too much of it, it starts to mess with like the dynamics of it. it doesn't sound as punchy. It softens it up. And so you want to dial that in to where you want it. And it's the same thing. It's a different saturation mode here, where it hits more of the peaks of the sound. And that's a preference thing. It's like, what do you want this master to sound like? How do you want that low end to be? Say you like that, but it's not punchy enough. Change that release time, shorten that up, see if that helps. Shorten it made it worse, so dial it over a little bit, extend that time. And you just dial that in to what you want that kick and that low end to sound. You're just trying to craft that sound to what you like, really. They talk about like industry standard sound. Someone who's done music production, for licensing and stuff like that. That's kind of a generic, statement for, does that sound good enough to make money on it? Because that's all they care about. As far as like publishing people and labels and stuff. Does that sound good enough to make money? Does that compare to other mixes that are making money right now? That's kind of the name of the game. But then, once you get this like low end dialed in, I don't really, mess with this too much. And we're talking peak versus RMS, and the difference between a peak is this is hitting the peaks. The RMS is the overall loudness, and so typically I just basically compress the peaks down. You can adjust these things though, and toy around with and the same thing here with like the mids, exact same knobs, different situation though, because you're dealing with different parts of the track. And so with the mid, I like to separate that in the stereo, where the bass is more centered in the stereo mix. I like to separate the mids, make it a little wider, and you can use something like the TT dynamic range meter to put the track in mono. And when you're messing with the stereo in mono, I like to do that just to check for phase issues, because what happens is when you have the same sounds, or maybe like a similar synth, if not the same synth, and you maybe double tracked it, or you layered it, well, if you have those hitting perfectly on top of each other, they're going to cancel out, and you're going to lose that sound. And there's like a scientific reason for that, but like for the purposes of this, I like to run it in mono, and then run that stereo and just listen for where that sound is hitting the best, as far as not losing anything to phase issues. And so, basically start to dial that in. And as you do that, then when you find a comfortable spot where everything sounds like it's hitting good, and you're not losing sound to phase issues, pop it out of mono. And that gives it kind of a good before and after too. Make sure that everything sounds good in mono, especially for electronic music, because a lot of DJs and sound systems, a lot of them will still run on mono. And so you definitely will make sure it sounds all right and good in mono, because if it doesn't, it's going to show. In the same situation then. Typically, for saturation on the mids, I try to. It just depends on the track, and you can toy with these different sounds. And if you have something plucky, this is kind of plucky. you might consider messing with the attack and release times again. Try to get those plucky sounds dialed in to a level where it's making the effect that you want it to have. And if you're not getting a lot of this compression, I've seen some people. I mean, they'll crank this shit up to like that, and just really compress it. And that's a choice that you got to make. What you want your sound to be. Just keep in mind, if you're cranking these levels, you're going to lose a lot of that dynamic range. It's like, it'll be loud, but at the same time, it's not going to be dynamic, and it's not going to sound spacious. It's just going to sound loud. And that's part of the loudness war, is when you start thinking that way of like, I'm just going to crank the shit out of this sound. I can sound like the people on the major labels. It's like, okay, you want to sound like a loud major label sound. That's on you. I mean, do what you want. But like, just to give you an idea what this pre and post gain knob does. I didn't really cover that in the low channel. This turns it up before the compression. Before it's affected by this. And then this post deals with how it sounds after the compression takes place. So maybe you want to dial it in, crank it up. So you got it cranked, but now the mids sound too high when you throw everything else in. You can bring that down. You can bring that down so it sits better as a whole. And back to the same. The next thing on the agenda is the highs. Typically with like the highs, you'll hear. I don't like to get super carried away with compressing hi-hats and everything, just because I feel like that they cut through a mix so strong. And the same thing with the release time on hi-hats and in the high end in general. Typically, if you push that release time out, they seem to have a better sizzle, or better cut through the mix. They don't sound so harsh. Because sometimes with that high end sound, it sounds almost piercing. And the same thing when it comes to like stereo separation. A lot of times the high end sounds better on some level if it's a little bit more stereo. That's a personal preference too, but just toy with it, see what it sounds like, because sometimes you'll get the very top end of a kick, and you might want that stereo a bit more centered, and that'll add a little bit more punch to maybe some snares or some top end to a kick. Same situation with the adding some saturation. You can throw it in however you want. The ceiling here, how much of it do you want to affect the sound? You want to affect the whole thing? Just keep it where it's at. You can mold the sound and how the saturation basically happens in the mix. And so this is all again personal preference. I feel like once you start cranking that saturation up, you start getting start losing some of that punchiness, and just kind of softens the sound. And maybe you want that. Typically that seems to be the result when you crank that saturation up, is it's just kind of softens it. And so once you have, I probably just janked my my master up just with this example, but then you got the same situation here. I don't like to compress it at this point, because I still have some other things I want to run through. So I don't compress the master. You could if you wanted to. I personally don't. And you can add a hint of saturation to the entire master if you wanted to, but with this, a little bit goes a long way. You know, if you're going to go ahead and do it, here's the difference. You know, so it gives you a bass line. I'm going to start cranking this up. It just kind of just softens the whole thing up. I don't know if you could hear that, if my meters are too quiet or not, but like you know, a little bit goes a long way with the saturation. And on the other hand, I like to use this Thrill Seeker XTC Blue, which is an exciter. And what that does is it gives more of an analog sound to digital and adds saturation. So, you know, if you wanted to get a little bit crazy with the saturation in Maximus, well, then when you're adding an exciter to the game plan here, well, now all of a sudden you're conflicting with some of what this does. And I'm gonna go ahead and just do like kind of a before and after, or just give you guys like a taste of what Thrill Seeker XTC Blue, what that kind of sounds like and what it does for the sound. Okay, so this is without it. And then this is with it. Yeah, so it gives it just like a little bit more of a fuller sound. I mean, I really dig this this plugin right here. And last I knew, this was a free thing, which I can put that in the description too. If yeah, if you wanted to go ahead and use it, I use it all the time. I think it adds a really cool character to the sound, and you know, basically what this mojo, you know, what that does, it starts adding more. Yeah, I don't know what's actually the word to it. It's just it starts giving it more. I want to say saturation, but it just gives it more and more. I don't know the best way to say it. It just gives it more oomph. You know, if you have like some guitars, you know, and they sound a little bit dry, or they sound a little bit, you know, digital, this mojo really just turns it up and just makes them sound more realistic for one, and just adds that, you know, warmth to it, you know. And so I really recommend using it. And then you can like dial in exactly what area, you know, what frequency you want this to hit, you know. And so this works great on kicks. You can dial in, you know, what frequency you want the exciter to start to work on. You know, you can get about 200 hertz. All of a sudden that you know, that kick starts popping. You can turn it up, you know, to get that sound that you want. And it's the same situation on all these different frequencies. You know, this works good too if you got like a snare that's not popping, you know, but popping in the mix. You can hit it right there, you know, and all of a sudden it'll start bringing that sound out. And yeah, you don't want to get too carried away with the mojo and the drive when you're mastering. I mean, you can take this to, you know, full tilt, on a different, like on a mixer channel, on an individual synth or sample or whatever you're working with. But the problem is when you're using this on a full mix, this mojo affects the high end in a kind of a weird way, and it makes the hi-hat sound a little funny. They just don't sound right. And then you can dial in how that sounds as a whole. Let me turn that down. You can turn it basically off to full. You can hear a difference, what this thing does. But again, it's something to start tinkering with in your master. These settings, they have pretty much some generic presets, but like they're just a starting spot. I like this warmth setting. That's full. This full mojo mode and the full drive on. But like it just depends on what you're working with. It's definitely interesting to toy around with these presets and try to get the sound that you're looking for. But then next thing on the agenda for mastering in FL Studio, I really like this Transient processor. It's a demo. I probably need to buy it, but like it came with this latest update, and so I've been toying with it on mastering. I think it does a great job of basically messing with these transients, these different sounds. I just think it just like ever so slightly, just like kind of just brightens some of this plucky, some of these plucky sounds out. And this isn't even really doing anything because I don't have a, let me just mess with the, you can definitely hear it affecting the kick, especially. But like this is another one of those. I like this plugin a lot. I just started messing with it with the new FL Studio update, but like I think it does an awesome job. It just really makes that start to come alive with using this Transient processor. And it's got different settings and everything. You'd have to look up everything to really get a feel for it. But this drive doesn't work great for if you're mastering, if you have this on the master channel. But like if you're working on a mix, if you're working on something that just needs a little bit, it's just like it just sounds dull. It doesn't sound like I don't know the best way to describe it, but this thing really does help make the track come out in a is a good plugin. I definitely recommend it. And then like last but not least, get rid of this. This is basically the final check mark to make sure that you're not clipping. And this is just like basically like just a brick wall limiter. It means everything that hits 0 dBs, it's just going to bring it down. And I've seen some people just crank this thing up, which if you want it to start getting super loud and losing your dynamic range, you could do that. And it's the same thing though. I mean, there's a point to it where, yeah, bring it up, because typically you'll have percussion that's more dynamic than a lot of the different single instruments. And the thing with it, you can start to get so carried away with compression. If you got, you say, just take this for example. Say you got something like this. Just a single instrument. Then you go throw something like Sound Goodizer on it. Which is a pretty big compression setting on the Sound Goodizer. I mean, you can start to hear it, in these delays. You hear that cutoff where it's ping-ponging back and forth between the two speakers. When you have more compression, that echo starts to become louder and louder. And so you're kind of wanting that to trail off because it gives some depth. And so what happens though is you start compressing and compressing. You compress all these different instruments. Well, now there's not very much dynamic range in the single tracks. Then you go to master it, and now you bring it up even more. And the biggest thing with the limiter is I wouldn't worry so much about just I need to crank the sound up. The thing of it is where does it sound good? Where's that spot where you brought it up and now it's you're down here, and this isn't a good representation because I had the volume down, so I can talk over it, but like so none of this is hitting zero, so nothing's super loud yet, the limiter's not doing anything, and so you bring this gain up. Well, now now you see it in action. Now it's starting to basically, all these peaks, all these things that are hitting over 0 decibels because it's too loud. It's compressing those down. It's not going to let it get over here. It's not going to let it get over this line because that's the ceiling that you set here. But default setting is 0, is where it should be. Well, now it's not. Now it is. So what this does is as soon as this gets to the point of 0, anything that gets over 0 starts to clip and distort the sound. So what this does is it prevents that. And so as you bring up this gain, these peaks are going to get squished down below 0. Meanwhile, this other bit of music here is going to get increased closer to 0. So you're bringing the lows, the highest peaks down, and the lowest quiet parts of the song up to make a, trying to get that sound that you want. And it works on the same thing as like Maximus with this attack and this release, sustain. You start dialing in this release time, to change the way this compression or this limiting setting, this brick wall limiter works. So if you have it, so you have it where it's like, it's doing a little bit of work here on these peaks, but it's taking away some of the punchiness. Well, it's only really affecting these peaks. Maybe if I start bringing that release time a little bit shorter. Maybe that'll tighten that sound up, and a lot of times it will. You tighten that up and you tighten that up, and you might gain some of that punchiness back that you've lost through compression. Same thing with the attack time. Say you're in the same situation where you got a decent amount hitting 0, but you're still hitting mostly the peaks because you didn't compress. I mean, if you compress this thing like let me just do a default setting so you can see the difference. Like, this is a sound goodizer preset, and this thing is, you can see the difference. Whereas before, there'd be basically the kick, some of the snare, some of that hitting. Well, now all that's been compressed, and now you're already dealing with a compressed piece of music that's hitting 0. And since I didn't save that or anything, so just have to kind of just go from here then. But it's the same situation. It's up to you to determine what kind of compression, what kind of sound you're trying to shape. But if you're just making it loud for the sake of loud to on some level try to compete with the sound that you hear maybe on the radio or from the major labels. I was looking at some of the music on Beatport. This is a while ago. I ended up putting it in this program, and you're dealing with tracks that had dynamic range of 5. And it's like, come on. I mean, that gets to be ridiculous. It has no dynamics. It's just blasting. And so when you're working at this final step in the limiter, it's really up to you what you want to do as far as the overall sound. But really, if you're getting, let me get a setting that's not so loudness worry. Probably this one will work. when now you're talking just a couple of the peaks hitting like that. You can adjust that sound with the release, the attack time, and bring up that gain until it starts to affect the way the sound is. Until it affects like the overall dynamic range of the whole thing. So it's not a super big deal if you're hitting 0. I mean, you want that. I mean, you want it to be loud enough where it's hitting that. I mean, you want loud music to a level that sounds good. It's another thing when the whole thing is just really compressed and just loud for the sake of loud. If you're doing it for a reason, with that reason being to make a track that you want to sound a particular way, and there's no reason to be afraid of hitting that. But at the same time, just inch it up there. If it's hitting like that, and maybe I don't like the sound of that kick, it's too soft. What we got when we turn that release time up? Is that snare then hitting too sharp? Because then you got to keep in mind what all it's hitting, what all this limiter's affecting, and so mess with this release time, mess with the sustain, mess with this attack time, and really just dial that sound in. You'd be amazed how much just affecting the release time on the limiter at the end can really just put that last little bit on a track. And the thing with it is, it's like it's a whole bunch of little things that add up to a cool sound. You just it's like making a making like a dessert or something. You put too much flour in a cake, it's gonna taste like shit. You gotta just dial these sounds in, and then listen to them before and after. Did that work? Did that sound better? Did that sound worse? Better or worse? It's like the eye doctor. And so because what happens, you start hearing the same track over and over and over and over, and then all of a sudden you can't tell if what you're doing is making it better, making it worse. So take breaks. take breaks so that you're not getting ear fatigue, especially in mastering. And sleep on it. I can't tell you how many times you get done with a track and you think it sounds good, and then the next day you hear it and it's like, ugh, what was I thinking? So take sleep on it. I mean, it's not a rush. Maybe it is. I don't know. I don't know what your situation is, but take ear breaks. It's definitely just give your. I don't know. Some people can reset their ears in a couple hours. Some people overnight. But that is an important part. And then burn a copy of it on a CD, and listen to it in your car. Listen to it in an environment where you listen to a lot of music, and judge it in that way. Listen to reference tracks. It definitely helps. But these are the main plugins that I use to master an FL Studio with electronic music and commercial music in general. I mean, I always use these. And I license music to film and television, and I've done that professionally for 7 years now. So it's worked for me, and it's provided a revenue stream for me using this kind of signal flow. And other than that, drop into a chat, because I've been doing this live. See if anybody's. Oh shoot, I'm not even. Yeah, it looks like Cody AI's in the chat. What's going on, dude? I don't know if you're still in here or not. But yeah, like I said, I was doing this live, and so I'll probably keep doing these live. And other than that, I think we'll probably wrap this up. I mean, maybe do maybe some mixing tutorials next, and maybe one of the things I was going to talk about, I had it pulled up, is how to submit music to music libraries. Like I said, I've been doing music in that way with licensing. It's been the main way I've gotten income as a musician, as a producer, is through syncs and licensing. And I've got let me pull up my IMDb page. So you got some TV placements and whatnot, and film placements and everything else. So I get these through, from licensing, through different libraries and stuff like that. So if you're trying to make some money with your music and looking for some revenue streams, I'll definitely be making some more of these live streams and putting out some advice and what's worked for me and what hasn't. So other than that, I'm trying to get on my thing to close this out. But thanks for listening, everybody, and until next time, thanks again, and God bless.